The luxurious hall of the Four Seasons Hotel was drowned in the golden light of crystal chandeliers. The charity evening in support of the Children's Hospital gathered all the color of Boston: politicians, businessmen, representatives of the oldest families of the city. Grayson Talbot carelessly adjusted his white gold cufflinks and looked around the room. In his 30s, he had already earned a reputation as one of the most influential young entrepreneurs on the East Coast. Construction companies, investment funds, a chain of high-end restaurants, his empire was growing by the month. No one questioned the sources of his capital. Talbot had a knack for getting the right people to come to him. She appeared in the hall when the evening was in full swing. Her emerald dress emphasized her slim figure, her red hair was gathered in an elegant knot. Grayson froze with a glass of wine as he watched the stranger gracefully maneuver between the guests. "Miss Kincaid," she introduced herself when their gazes finally met. "Astrid Kincaid. I represent the Troubled Teen Foundation. Grayson Talbot." He bowed his head slightly. "I don't remember you at an event like this before." "I just moved here from Chicago." Astrid smiled. "They say Boston has more opportunities for charitable projects." 3 hours before this conversation, in an unremarkable office building in the city's business district, Astrid had been sitting at a desk across from her FBI handler. "Talbot will be at the event." Agent Marcus Reynolds spread the photos in front of her. "This is our chance. For 2 years we've been trying to get close to his organization, but he's too cautious. We need someone on the inside." "I've been going through his file." Astrid pored over the photos. "Single, no close relationships. What makes you think it'll work with me?" "Because you're the best," Reynolds replied simply. "And because we don't have a choice. Weapons, drugs, millions of dollars laundered through its structures. But everything looks spotlessly clean." Now, standing next to Talbot in a room filled with the sounds of a string quartet, Astrid noted how accurately his dossier had been compiled. Tall, trim, with a strong-willed chin and an attentive look in his gray eyes. Impeccable suit, expensive watch, the confident movements of a man accustomed to command. "Let me show you our roof garden," Grayson suggested after half an hour of casual conversation. "The view of the city from up there is spectacular." They took the elevator up. The evening breeze played with the leaves in the tubs of exotic plants. Below, Boston glowed with thousands of lights. "Beautiful," Astrid breathed out. "So are you." Grayson turned to her. "I must say, I haven't met anyone as interesting to talk to in a long time." Astrid smiled as she felt his scrutinizing gaze on her. The first step had been taken. Now she needed to consolidate her success to become part of his world. She couldn't allow herself to think about the price she might have to pay for this introduction. "I hope to see you again, Mr. Talbot. Call me Grayson, and I'll do my best to make it happen as soon as possible." It was an unusually quiet morning in a coffee shop on the outskirts of Boston. Astrid stirred her cooled Americano, casually observing the sparse clientele. The 3 weeks since the fundraiser had flown by like a day Grayson had wooed her beautifully, showering her with flowers and invitations to elite events. "What do you got?" Reynolds appeared stealthily, sliding into a nearby chair, pretending to study the menu. "Only superficial observations so far," Astrid said quietly, not turning her head. "He's cautious, mostly social gatherings, business meetings. But there is something interesting. Yesterday in his office, I noticed a man on the watch list, Hawkins Durand. His right-hand man," Reynolds nodded. "What was he doing?" "Bringing in some paperwork. They talked about shipments through the port. Talbot mentioned a shipment from Mexico." Reynolds tensed subtly. "We need the details of that deal. Can you get closer?" "He invited me to dinner at his country house this Friday, promised to introduce me to his inner circle." At lunchtime that afternoon, Astrid entered the Talbot Corporation headquarters, a 40-story glass and steel tower in the downtown business district. The guard nodded respectfully. She was already known by sight. Grayson himself met her on the top floor. "You look especially beautiful tonight." He kissed her hand. "Let me introduce you to my closest assistant, Hawkins Durand." The tall, thin man with the keen eyes bowed his head slightly. "I've heard a lot about you, Miss Kincaid. Grayson hasn't been talking about anyone else lately." Astrid caught the slight wariness in his voice. Durand was like a watchdog, loyal to his master and distrustful of strangers. After lunch in Talbot's private office, Durand unfolded a map of the port on the table. The South Terminal would be free on Tuesday. The cargo can be held under the guise of building materials. Make sure the paperwork's in order, Grayson said, and alert our people at customs. Astrid pretended to be fascinated by the view from the panoramic windows, but she didn't miss a word. The scale of Talbot's operations was impressive. He controlled whole sections of the port, had his own people in customs and the police. That evening they had dinner in his penthouse. Grayson opened a collector's wine, turned on some soft music. You know what I find most attractive about you? He gently touched her arm. You're not like the others. No falseness, no attempt to impress. Astrid felt a prick of conscience. Her every smile, every gesture was carefully thought out. She was carefully playing the role of an infatuated woman impressed by his charisma and position. You're a very unusual man, Grayson. She met his gaze. I've never met anyone like you. At least it was true. Talbot did stand out. Sharp mind, power, a predatory grace in his every move. He could charm, but he never lost control. The next morning, Astrid gave Reynolds information about an upcoming shipment. The wiretap department had installed a special communication system in her apartment, disguised as an ordinary floor lamp. Be very careful, the handler warned. Durand may be checking up on you. The slightest mistake and the whole operation is jeopardized. I'll be fine, she assured him, though her insides were tight with tension. Friday night, Talbot's limousine drove them out of town. Astrid stared at his profile, clearly defined in the oncoming headlights. She was beginning to realize why all attempts at infiltration had failed before. Talbot wasn't just a criminal. He was a man who had created his own empire. Smart, ruthless, and incredibly attractive. The country estate was breathtakingly large, a huge Georgian mansion, a well-tended park, stables. Durand met them at the entrance with several people from Talbot's inner circle. Welcome to my real home, Grayson put his arm around Astrid's waist. Here I can be myself. She felt her pulse quicken. What did it mean to be herself for a man who held a criminal empire in his hands? This evening could be a breakthrough in the investigation, or the beginning of the end. Rain drummed on the bedroom windows of the Talbots' country house. Astrid lay awake, listening to his steady breathing. Over the past 2 months, this house had become almost home to her. The cozy library with its collection of first editions, the winter garden where Grayson liked to drink his morning coffee, even this huge bedroom overlooking the park. He moved in his sleep, drawing her to him, so warm, so alive, so real. Astrid ran her fingers gently over his shoulder. When had all this started? When had she started noticing not just facts to report, but details that made him special? Here was Grayson making her breakfast himself, because he remembered how she'd once mentioned her love of French toast, or picking up an emerging artist's painting from a charity auction, simply because Astrid liked it. Little things that turn a calculating businessman into a man capable of sincere feelings. Once she caught him in the children's oncology ward. He came there every month, without cameras and reporters. He just sat with the children, read books to them, brought them gifts. My sister died here when she was 9. He said quietly then. I vowed that I would do whatever I could to help other children. They took a long walk along the waterfront that evening. Grayson talked about his childhood, about his parents broken by their daughter's death, about how he'd learned early on to rely on himself. You're the only person I've ever told this to, he admitted, squeezing her hand. With you, I can be myself. Not the person everyone's used to seeing, but just me. At breakfast that morning, Durand brought some papers. Grayson looked them over, frowned. Tell our friends at the port to hold the shipment. I heard there might be trouble there. But we've already received an advance payment. Give me the money back. I'm not risking people's lives. Astrid froze with a cup of coffee. She knew there were weapons in that shipment. Talbot had just turned down a big deal because of the possible risk to outsiders. In the evening, he took her to the opera. They sat in a box, and Astrid felt his gaze on her, warm, studying. At intermission, Grayson pulled a velvet box from his pocket. This was my mother's. I think she would have wanted you to have it. An elegant white gold necklace with sapphires lay around her neck. Astrid stared into the mirror, not recognizing her own eyes, something new and frighteningly deep in them. "I love you," Grayson said simply. "You changed my life, showed me that I could be better." She turned to him, feeling her heart hammering in her chest. His kiss was gentle, almost chaste. Nothing existed in that moment. Not the other people outside the walls of the lodge, not the cargo in the harbor, not the double life. Just the two of them and the music of Verdi floating beneath the vaults of the opera house. Later, filling out another report, Astrid caught herself for the first time defending his decisions, finding excuses for his actions. She remembered his eyes when he talked about the children in the hospital, remembered how he'd canceled the deal so as not to risk other people's lives. The rain was still pounding on the windows. Grayson mumbled something in his sleep, and she snuggled closer, inhaling the familiar scent of his skin. Somewhere on the edge of her consciousness, a traitorous thought flickered. She was no longer playing the role of a woman in love. She was a woman in love, and that was what was most frightening. The glass elevator rose silently to the top floor of Talbot Tower. Astrid looked out at the city below, absently adjusting the collar of her blouse. It had been a busy last week. She'd overheard Grayson's phone call about a large shipment of weapons from Eastern Europe. The reception area was unusually empty. Muffled voices came from behind the loose office door. Astrid slowed her steps. "I don't trust her." Duran's voice was harsh. "She asks too many questions. Too often she's in places she shouldn't be." "You're exaggerating," Grayson sounded annoyed. "Astrid is just curious. It's natural." "Natural?" Duran chuckled. "And it's natural for her to go through your desk while you were in a meeting?" There was a long pause. Astrid felt a chill run down her spine. She had indeed looked through the documents in Grayson's desk 2 days ago, but she was sure she had gone unnoticed. "Do you have proof?" Talbot's voice grew hard. "Not yet, but I will. You know I'm always looking out for your best interests." Astrid pushed the door open firmly. "Good morning, gentlemen." Duran twitched, but quickly pulled himself together. Grayson brightened when he saw her. "You're early. I missed you." She kissed him on the cheek, feeling Duran's hard gaze on her. That evening, sitting in her favorite chair in the library, she listened to Grayson discuss the details of the upcoming deal. 5 containers of weapons. Cargo value $80 million. Delivery in 3 weeks. Everything has to go perfectly. Talbot paced the room. No traces, no witnesses. "I'll take care of the paperwork." Duran nodded. "But there's something else we need to discuss." His gaze slid to Astrid. Grayson grimaced. Not now. As she lay awake at night, she thought about the deal. This much weaponry could result in hundreds of casualties. The Grayson she'd known, caring, considerate, compassionate, seemed so far removed from this cold-blooded merchant of death. The next day, Duran seemed to follow her like a shadow. She felt his presence everywhere, in the office, in the restaurant, even in the underground parking lot. He was studying her, waiting. On Friday, Grayson took her to dinner at a new restaurant on the waterfront. She was on her way down to the garage when Duran emerged from the darkness. "Don't think you can fool him. I don't know who you really are, but I will." And then, he didn't finish his sentence, just turned and disappeared. Astrid struggled to get behind the wheel. Her hands were shaking. At dinner, Grayson was unusually pensive. He was absent-mindedly picking at his seafood, barely making conversation. Only at the end of the evening he seemed to wake up. "You know, I never believed in love at first sight. I thought it was a fantasy. And then you came along." She smiled, feeling her heart clench. There was such sincerity in his voice, such vulnerability. And in 3 weeks, a shipment would arrive that she must help intercept. A shipment that would send Grayson to prison for years to come. That night, for the first time, she truly realized she couldn't betray him, couldn't watch his world crumble, even if it was the right thing to do, even if it was her duty. In the morning, she found a note in her purse, written in Duran's sharp handwriting, "I'm watching you. One false move and you will regret it." It started with a small thing. Astrid had left her phone on the living room table when she left to shower. Grayson happened to notice an incoming message. "Report ready. Delivery data received." The number was unfamiliar. He frowned, but brushed away the uneasy feeling. Little did he know what kind of reports a charitable foundation might have, but the worm of doubt had already begun to gnaw at his soul. 2 days later, Durand placed another folder of suspicions in front of him. Grayson habitually pushed it aside. "You're being too imaginative. I'm tired of your paranoia. Look at the security tapes," the assistant insisted. "Right here in your office, when you were in the meeting." Grayson gritted his teeth but turned on the tape. Astrid at his desk, methodically going through the files, taking pictures on her phone. "That doesn't mean anything." His voice trembled. "She could be looking for charity files." "In a folder labeled Supplies. Secret?" Durand shook his head. "Boss, you're blind, in love and blind." That was the first time Grayson let himself doubt. Started noticing the little things, the way she tensed up at certain conversations. The way she asks a little more specific questions than she should. The way she sometimes excused herself without explanation. The final straw was overhearing her say, "Yes, information confirmed. Continuing surveillance." Astrid said this into the phone, thinking she was alone in the greenhouse. He ordered her to be checked out, thoroughly, deeply, using all connections. The results of the check lay now in front of him in a thin folder. FBI agent Astrid Kincaid. The evening at the country house began as usual. Grayson had returned late. Astrid was waiting for him in the library with a glass of wine. On the table was a small velvet box. She was preparing to surprise him by buying engraved cufflinks. He came in, unaccustomed to silence. He stopped in the doorway, looking at her as if he had seen her for the first time, a thin folder in his hand. "You know, I didn't believe Durand." His voice sounded muffled, broken. "When he brought the first suspicions, I almost fired him, defended you, said he was paranoid." Astrid set her glass down slowly. Something in his gaze made her go cold. "Agent Astrid Kincaid." He opened the folder. 4 years with the FBI, specialized in criminal infiltration, immaculate record. There was silence between them, dense, viscous, like the pre-thunderstorm air. Grayson ran his hand over his face. "I loved you, really loved you. For the first time in my life, I let myself—" He paused, as if short of breath. "Grayson, don't talk." He held up his hand. "Just don't say anything. Every word you said was a lie. Every look, every touch, everything was a lie." "No." She stepped toward him. "Not everything. Ia set up our meeting on purpose." His lips curved. "Entered my house, into my life, into my heart." God, how blind I was. He sank into the chair, hunched over, covering his face with his hands. In that moment, he didn't look like the powerful head of a criminal empire, just a broken man who'd lost everything he believed in. "I did fall in love with you," Astrid said quietly. "It wasn't part of the assignment. It wasn't a game." Grayson lifted his head. Tears stood in his eyes. "You know what the worst part is? I believe you. Even now I do. And that makes it hurt even more." He stood up, walked to the window. His shoulders were unnaturally tense. "Go away," he said, barely audible. "Just go. Now. Grayson, please. Go!" He turned sharply and Astrid jerked back. There was so much pain, so much despair in his gaze. She walked slowly toward the door. When she turned around, he was standing at the window again, motionless as if carved from stone. "I loved you," she whispered. "I swear it was true." He didn't answer, didn't move. Only when the door closed behind her did his shoulders shake in a silent sob. Astrid got into the car. Her hands were shaking so badly she couldn't put the key in the ignition. The road twisted between the trees, headlights picking out the wet asphalt from the darkness. The rain was getting heavier. On a sharp curve, she noticed oncoming headlights. She twisted the steering wheel, trying to avoid a collision. The car swerved, lost traction. The last thing she saw was Durand's tall silhouette by the side of the road. And then the world went dark. In the library, Grayson was still standing at the window. Raindrops dripped down the glass. Or tears? He couldn't tell anymore. "It's done." Durand's voice came from behind him. "Go away," Grayson said in a muffled voice. "Just go." Alone, he pulled a small photograph from his desk drawer of him and Astrid at the opera, her head tilted back, laughing. Real, alive. The only woman he had ever truly loved. The photograph flew into the fireplace. The flames greedily licked the glossy paper, turning the happy smiles to ash. So did his heart. Heavy leaden clouds draped the sky over Boston. It rained for the third day, turning the streets into mirrors. Detective Reed Callahan was finishing his fourth cup of coffee, staring out the precinct window when his partner entered the office. "The agent has been out of contact for 48 hours. Maeve Rosenthal placed a folder in front of him. "The FBI is joining us in the search." Callahan chuckled. "Why the city police? Don't they have enough of their own people? This is our jurisdiction, and we have more local connections." They leaned over the paperwork. The last contact with Astrid Kincaid was on Friday night, a short signal from her phone in the area of Talbot's country house. Nothing after that. "What is known about the last few days?" Callahan rubbed the bridge of his nose. "A lot of strange things." Maeve unfolded the map. She'd sent an incomplete report the day before she disappeared, mentioned that Durand suspected something, and there was something about a big deal being set up. By late afternoon, they'd canvassed every informant in the harbor. No one had seen anything, or didn't want to see. Talbot's empire was as much about fear as money. "We should check the road from his house." Callahan frowned. "In this weather." He didn't finish. A young officer appeared in the doorway. Uniforms found evidence of an accident at the turnoff off Oak Road. Looks like an off-ramp. Cars down below the cliff. 20 minutes later, the squad SUV pulled onto a narrow road winding between the hills. The rain had turned to drizzle. Police cars were already on the side of the road, flashing their flashing beacons. "Right here." The officer shined his flashlight on the crumpled fence. The car smashed through it and went flying down. Callahan stepped cautiously to the edge. In the light of the rescue team's spotlights, a mangled silver BMW could be seen below, exactly like Astrid's. "The plates match," the forensics officer shouted from below. "That's her car." They found the body in the passenger compartment. The impact was so severe, the car folded around the driver's seat. It took the rescue team over an hour to remove the body. No signs of struggle. Maeve was flipping through the preliminary report. "Looks like a loss of control in the wet. She skidded on a curve." "Too convenient," Callahan interrupted. "An undercover agent suddenly crashes just as a major operation is being prepared?" They drove to Talbot's place first thing in the morning. His mansion greeted them with impeccable order and well-trained servants. Grayson himself received them in the library, pale, red-eyed, but immaculately dressed. "It's terrible." His voice was muffled. "I can't believe it. We had a fight that night. She left so suddenly. If only I'd known." "Where were you at the time of the accident?" Maeve asked sharply. "Here in the library. I was up all night working. You can ask the guards and the servants." "And your assistant, Mr. Durand?" "Chicago. He left Friday afternoon for an investor meeting. Tickets, hotel check-in, all the paperwork's with my secretary. Perfect alibi, perfect explanations, precision grief in every gesture. You don't ask why the police and not the highway department are handling a routine accident," Callahan remarked. Talbot looked up at him with inflamed eyes. "I loved her, Detective. What difference does it make who's investigating now? She's dead. Nothing else matters." There was such genuine pain in his voice that for a moment even Callahan hesitated, but only for a moment. "We'll be back, Mr. Talbot." "Of course." He turned back to the window. "I'm always at your service." In the car, Maeve shook her head. "He's thought of everything, every little detail." "Yeah," Callahan started the engine. "But you know what's weird? His pain. It's real." The June heat blanketed Boston in a sweltering dome. In the small conference room of the police department, the air conditioners hummed, struggling to keep up with the heat. Callahan looked at a board hung with photos from the scene, expert reports, charts and diagrams. Two investigations were going on in parallel. For the press and the public, a tragic accident that had claimed the life of a young female employee of a charitable foundation. For a small circle of the initiated, a carefully planned assassination of a federal agent. There was a knock at the door. Maeve brought the new reports. Forensics had finished with the car. There were no signs of tampering. Brake system was fine. And the tracks on the side of the road? Rain washed them out. But there's something interesting. She's got the photos spread out. Look at the angle of the exit ramp. If she'd really skidded, the trajectory would have been different. Callahan nodded. He'd seen enough accidents in his 20 years on the job to know something didn't add up. Meanwhile, Talbot was playing the part of the grieving groom flawlessly. Organized a lavish funeral, established a scholarship named after Astrid for medical students, gave a moving interview about his loss. The newspapers raved about the tragic love story. Witnesses? Callahan looked away from the photos. Nothing useful. Security confirms he never left the house. The servants saw him in the library. Durand was in Chicago, confirmed by airport cameras, hotel records. A young lab tech walks into the room with a new file. Detective, we found something strange in the victim's blood. Traces of a drug that, not here, Maeve cut him off. Not here, Maeve cut him off. They went down to the lab. There, among the microscopes and chemical analyzers, a lab technician showed them the results. Strong sleeping pills. In that concentration, it could cause unconsciousness behind the wheel. Callahan swore. How do we prove it? Any lawyer will say she could have taken the pill herself. They've interviewed everyone who might have known something. The bartender at Talbot's favorite restaurant. The doorman at his office. Even the gardener who saw Astrid leaving that evening. She looked upset, the old man recalled. But not drunk, no. She was always very careful behind the wheel. By evening, they had an impressive stack of testimony, but not a single piece of direct evidence. Talbot was too smart to leave traces. Maeve lingered at the picture board. You know what the creepy thing is? He really loved her. Look at his eyes in the courtroom when the death certificate was read. You can't play that kind of pain. That's why he did it all by himself. Callahan gathered up the papers. He didn't trust anyone. A private matter must remain private. Late that night, they reviewed the traffic cam footage. One of them, set up a mile before the accident, had captured a black SUV following Astrid's car. 15 minutes later, it drove in the opposite direction, alone. License plate? Maeve stepped forward. Couldn't see it, and the car was too common. The next day, Talbot gave a press conference about expanding charity programs. Standing behind the cordon, Callahan watched the impeccably dressed businessman talk about helping children, about Astrid's legacy, about the importance of doing good. Only when the cameras turned off did the detective notice Talbot's hand trembling, clutching the papers. The mask slipped for a moment, revealing the bottomless longing in his eyes. Perfect crime, Callahan muttered. No evidence. Perfect alibi. But you know what? It's his heart that gives him away. Do you think he'll break? Maeve shook her head. No. He's too good at taking a punch. But every time he says her name in public, he dies a little inside. And that's his real punishment. Hawkins Duran hasn't been able to sleep properly for a week now. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the same picture: a mangled car in the rain, a black SUV, a man who looked just like himself getting on a plane to Chicago. Talbot was a planning genius. The double, found through old connections, had spent a perfect weekend in Chicago, checking into hotels, eating at restaurants, meeting with investors. Meanwhile, the real Durand waited on a deserted road until the effects of the sleeping pills began to take their toll on Astrid's reactions. Now, a month later, he was catching more and more of his boss's strange looks. Talbot had become quiet, withdrawn, almost never showed up at the office, canceled meetings, and when he did show up, he looked through his assistant with a paused stare. Duran realized he was the only witness, the only one who knew the truth, and that knowledge had become a deadly weight. Detective Callahan bumped into him yesterday outside a coffee shop, handed him a business card, casually dropped it. If you want to talk, call me anytime. The call came at 3 a.m. Durand flinched, dropped his whiskey glass. Talbot's number popped up on the screen. There's an important meeting tomorrow. His boss's voice sounded strangely muffled. Get there early. We need to discuss the details. Sure. Durand swallowed. What time? 7. And Hawkins. You realize how important absolute loyalty is, don't you? The connection went dead. Durand poured more whiskey with shaky hands. 7 o'clock in the morning, an empty office. Details of a meeting he was hearing about for the first time. Callahan's business card burned his pocket. One call and he was protected. But then what? Witness protection program, a new name, a life of constant fear, and if he doesn't call, Talbot wasn't the type to leave witnesses behind, especially now that his heart died with the one he loved. At 5 a.m., Durand pulled out his cell phone, dialed the number. "This is Detective Callahan. I know the truth about the accident, but I need assurances." There was silence on the other end. "Come down to the station now." "No," Durand laughed nervously. "I'm being followed. I'll meet you somewhere else, and I want written assurances of protection." "Where?" "The old dock at the harbor. It's safe there, and I'll show you something interesting." Callahan grinned. "You expect us to believe an alibi with a double? I have proof. Photographs, recordings of conversations. Talbot planned the whole thing, but I took precautions." There was silence again. 6 a.m. alone. Durand hung up, took a file out of the safe. His hands trembled. Betrayal. But did he have a choice? Talbot would take him out anyway. At least this way he'd have a chance to survive. He didn't see the black SUV following his car through the deserted streets. Didn't see the metal in the driver's hand gleam in the light of the rising sun. Talbot never left any witnesses. The old dock greeted Callahan with pre-dawn fog and the smell of seaweed. Somewhere in the distance, the first tugboats were humming. The detective walked slowly between the containers with his hand on his holster. Behind him, plainclothes operatives moved silently. They found Durand near a rusty warehouse hangar. He was half sitting against the wall, clutching a leather folder to his chest. A dark puddle spread beneath him, soaking into the concrete. "Ambulance!" Callahan shouted, rushing toward the wounded man. "Too late!" Durand wheezed. He knew everything, always, one step ahead. His fingers loosened, releasing the folder. "Here, all the evidence, photographs of the doppelganger, recorded conversations. He, made me..." Durand's eyes rolled back, but he found the strength for the last words. He loved her. He really loved her. That's why. He did it all himself. He didn't trust anyone else. His head slumped back. Callahan checked his pulse. Nothing. They found everything in the file. Photos of a man who looked like Durand at the Chicago airport. Cell phone records. The results of the sleeping pills. And most importantly, a letter. "Grayson, by the time you read this, I'll be dead. You've always had a knack for thinking several moves ahead. I guess you knew I'd try to save my life, that I'd start gathering evidence against you. I saw how much you loved her. I saw the agony of finding out the truth. You've never been happier than you were in those months with her, and you've never been so broken. I confess I was afraid of you. I always have been. But that night, I saw your tears in the library. I saw your hands trembling. You weren't a ruthless boss. Just a man with a broken heart. I'm sorry to have to betray you, but you realize I had no choice. Hawkins Durand." They took Talbot into his office. He wasn't even surprised to see the police. He listened silently to the accusations. He calmly put his hands under the cuffs. "You understand, don't you, detective?" he asked Callahan quietly. "I had to do it myself. She betrayed me, but I loved her. I loved her to my last breath." In the courtroom, he held the same icy calm. He didn't deny guilt, didn't ask for leniency. Only when Durand's testimony was read did his fingers faintly tremble. 25 years without parole. Murder of a federal agent in the line of duty. Commissioned murder of a witness. The last word was short. "I'm guilty. Of everything. But you know what the worst part is? I'd do it again. Because there's no worse pain than betraying someone you love more than life." The last time Callahan saw him, Talbot was being led out of the gym. Stiff, with his back straight and his head held high. Only in his eyes was a bottomless longing. "You know what I realized?" Detective Maeve said. "There's love that kills, literally. And then there's justice that makes no one happy," she said. "Come on, let's go. We have a new case." They walked out into the drizzling rain. Sirens could be heard in the distance. Boston lived its life, and in a maximum security cell, a man named Grayson Talbot stared at a photograph of a red-haired woman and relived the happiest and worst night of his life. It was almost dark in Detective Callahan's office. A thin, leather-bound notebook lay on the desk in the light of the desk lamp. It had been found in Astrid's apartment, hidden under the floorboards. the personal diary she had kept all these months. Maeve sat in the armchair, rereading the last pages. I thought it would be easy, another assignment, another role, but Grayson turned out to be something else entirely. Behind the mask of a cynical businessman hides an incredibly deep, complex man. He knows how to love the way few people do these days, completely, without abandon, giving all of himself. I betray him every day, with every report, every call to my sponsor, and it gets harder every day. Because his love is real, and so is mine. Today, I saw him spend an hour with a little girl in the hospital, reading her stories while her mother slept in the hallway. This man, who is considered a ruthless criminal, wiped a child's tears and told silly jokes to make her laugh. I must see this through. I have to help take him and the whole organization down. But I no longer believe in absolute evil. I don't believe you can divide the world into black and white. If you're reading this, Grayson, know that my love for you was real. Every kiss, every touch, every look. I betrayed you, but I didn't betray my feelings. Forgive me, and know this. In another life, in another world, I would have chosen you, no matter what. Callahan poured himself a whiskey. So much for the story. Two lovers unlucky enough to find themselves on opposite sides of the law. A tragedy, pure and simple. Maeve closed her journal. No one meant any harm. Everyone did what they thought was right. You know what the worst part is? The detective walked to the window. If Talbot had just killed her in a rage, it would have make more sense. But he planned the whole thing. He found a double for Durand, got the sleeping pills, picked a spot. He made sure she didn't suffer. Even in revenge, he showed love. Footsteps sounded in the corridor as the duty officer brought the last report. Forensics finally confirmed. Death occurred before the accident. The car with dead Astrid had gone into the ditch on autopilot. Case closed. Maeve stamped the file. Talbot got his time. Durand's dead. Astrid. At least she died knowing she was truly loved. Callahan remained silent. In the semi-darkness of the office, they both thought of one thing. Sometimes the worst crimes aren't committed out of hate. Sometimes they are caused by love. Real, burning love that leaves no choice. The prison visiting room was small and impersonal. Grayson Talbot sat at a desk with his hands folded in handcuffs. His orange robe contrasted oddly with his still-so-straight posture. Callahan placed the leather journal on the table. We found this in her apartment. I think you should read it. Talbot didn't even move. Why are you here, detective? Because this story deserves an ending, for everyone involved. Maeve moved the journal closer. She loved you. Truly. The mask of indifference on Talbot's face trembled for the first time since his imprisonment began. His fingers touched the leather binding, carefully, almost reverently. The detectives stepped out. Through the thick glass, they saw Talbot open the journal. How he froze, reading the lines. His shoulders began to shake. Do you think we did the right thing? Maeve asked. Yes. Callahan turned away from the glass. Everyone deserves to know the truth, even if it hurts. When they picked up the journal an hour later, Talbot was the same as before, calm, straight back, and blank stare. There was moisture in the corners of his eyes. Thank you, he said with only his lips. They walked out into the bright summer sun. The story had finally reached its conclusion, bitter as true love and inevitable as fate itself.